I always believed that trust, like the foundation of a house, could weather any storm. I built my marriage on that belief, convinced that no matter what, Melissa and I would stand strong together. But I was wrong. And it all started with a simple, dripping pipe. It was a Monday evening when I first heard it, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of water against porcelain. I followed the sound through our bathroom sink, where a steady leak had formed beneath the cabinet. Melissa was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. "Hon, we've got a leak," I called out. She peeked her head in, frowning at the small puddle forming under the pipe. "I'll call someone tomorrow," she said casually. I could have fixed it myself, but work had been relentless, and honestly, I was too tired to care. So I nodded and left it at that. The next evening, when I got home from work, Melissa greeted me with an odd brightness. "The plumber came by today," she said. "That was quick," I replied, shrugging off my jacket. "Yeah, he was able to squeeze us in," she said, turning back to the stove. Something about the way she spoke, the way she avoided eye contact, made my stomach tighten. I should have known then. But I didn't. Not yet. The leak was fixed, but something about Melissa's demeanor stuck with me. I brushed it off at first, maybe I was just imagining things. But as the days passed, I noticed subtle changes in her. She started wearing perfume more often, a scent she hadn't used in years. She checked her phone more frequently, smiling at messages she never shared with me. And then there was the humming, little tunes she sang absently while cooking or folding laundry, as if some secret joy had taken root inside her. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, I casually asked, "Who was the plumber?" Melissa froze for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Oh, just some guy from a local company. Mike, I think." Mike. It was a simple name, but something about the way she said it, too quickly, too carefully, set off a quiet alarm in my mind. I didn't press her. Not yet. But I remembered the name. And I started watching. I tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But paranoia has a funny way of creeping in when something doesn't feel right. A few days later, I came home earlier than usual. Melissa wasn't expecting me. As I stepped inside, I heard her laughter, soft, warm, and unfamiliar in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the laugh she gave me anymore. I followed the sound to the kitchen. She was leaning against the counter, her phone pressed to her ear. The smile on her face was different, genuine, uninhibited. It was the way she used to smile at me. She saw me then, and her expression changed instantly. Her fingers tensed around the phone. "I have to go," she said quickly, her voice suddenly stiff. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, taking in the tension in her posture, the way she avoided my eyes as she set her phone down on the counter. "Who was that?" I finally asked. "Just a friend," she replied too quickly. "From work." A lie. I could feel it in my bones. Melissa had always been a terrible liar. When she was telling the truth, she met my gaze without hesitation. When she wasn't, she did what she was doing now, busying herself with meaningless tasks, shuffling dishes, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. I walked over to the sink, pretending to grab a glass of water. Her phone was still unlocked. Just for a second, I saw the name at the top of her messages. Mike. My stomach twisted. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, I drank my water, set the glass down, and kissed her on the forehead. "I have some work to finish," I said, my voice steady. She exhaled, relieved, maybe, and nodded. I walked out of the kitchen, my hands in my pockets, my mind racing. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The name kept flashing in my mind, over and over again. Mike. The plumber. I needed proof. The next morning, I woke up before Melissa. She was curled up on her side, her breathing slow and even. I stared at her for a long time, wondering how much of what we had was real anymore. Was I sleeping next to a stranger? I needed answers. By the time Melissa woke up, I was already dressed and sipping my coffee at the kitchen table. She stretched, kissed me absent-mindedly on the cheek, and went about her morning routine as if everything was normal. But normal didn't exist anymore. After she left for work, I picked up my phone and searched for local plumbing services. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, a company with 12 employees, including a Mike Henderson. I clicked on the company's website and stared at his photo. Tall. Dark hair. Lean build. Younger than me. I closed my phone, my jaw tightening. My gut had been right. There was something there. But I wasn't the kind of man to make wild accusations without proof. So I made a plan. That afternoon, I drove down to the plumbing office and walked inside like any regular customer. A young woman at the desk greeted me with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a casual tone. "I had some work done at my house a little while ago. A leak under the sink. I think the guy's name was Mike." She turned to her computer, typing quickly. "Let me check. What's the address?" I gave it to her, my pulse quickening. "Ah, here it is," she said. "Yeah, Mike was the one assigned to that job. Do you need a follow-up appointment?" I shook my head. "Nah, just wanted to remember the name. He did a great job." She beamed. "That's great to hear. Mike's one of our best." "I bet he is," I thought bitterly. I left the office and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. There was no more doubt. No more pretending. I wasn't crazy. Melissa had invited another man into our home. And now I needed to know how far it had gone. That night, I acted normal. I kissed her when she walked through the door. I asked her how her day was. I even laughed at a stupid joke she made about her coworker. But inside, I was screaming. I waited until she was asleep before I made my move. Carefully, I slid out of bed and reached for her phone on the nightstand. My hands were steady, my heart beat anything but. Melissa never locked her phone. She trusted me. That made this all the more painful. I opened her messages and scrolled down to Mike. My stomach twisted at the sheer number of texts. Dozens. Hundreds. More than she had ever sent me in the past few months. I started reading. "Had a great time today. You always make me laugh. Can't stop thinking about last night. I wish we had more time. I hate sneaking around." I forced myself to keep going. The messages weren't graphic, but they didn't need to be. The words painted a clear enough picture. Late-night conversations. Inside jokes. Private moments that should have been mine. And then I found it. A message from just 2 nights ago. "I wish I could wake up next to you instead." I put the phone down. My hands were shaking. I had seen enough. The foundation of my marriage had cracked. And now it was time to bring the whole thing crashing down. I didn't confront Melissa that night. I wanted to. Every fiber of my being burned with the urge to wake her up, shove the phone in her face, and demand answers. But I didn't. Because I knew if I played my cards right, I could do more than just confront her, I could make her regret ever betraying me. So I lay there, staring at the ceiling, while my wife slept peacefully beside me, oblivious to the storm about to hit. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed. I kissed her goodbye as she left for work, told her I loved her, words that now felt hollow but necessary. And the moment she was out the door, I got to work. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. I didn't want a messy, drawn-out divorce. I wanted control. I wanted to make sure that when the dust settled, I walked away with my dignity intact, and Melissa walked away with nothing but regret. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Claire, listened patiently as I laid everything out. The messages. The secrecy. The plumber. You want a divorce? She asked. Eventually, I said. But not yet. She leaned forward. Then what do you want? I exhaled slowly. I want to make her feel what I feel. I want her to understand what she's throwing away before she loses it. Claire smiled slightly. Revenge, then. I didn't deny it. Step 2 was gathering more evidence. Melissa had gotten comfortable. Too comfortable. She thought she was in control, that I was clueless. That was her first mistake. Over the next few days, I played the part of the devoted husband while keeping a careful eye on her. I noted the times she smiled at her phone, the excuses she made to leave the house, the nights she worked late, but came home with her hair slightly tousled and her perfume freshly applied. And then, I set a trap. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I pretended to check my phone. Hey, I said casually. My buddy Steve is looking for a plumber. Didn't you say the guy who fixed our sink was good? Melissa's body tensed, so slightly that most people wouldn't notice. But I did. Oh, She hesitated, forcing a smile. Yeah, his name was Mike, I think. But I don't have his number anymore. Liar. I let it go, pretending not to notice, and waited. 2 days later, I went through our phone records. Melissa had deleted the texts, but she couldn't erase the call logs. And there it was, Mike's number, repeated again and again. Calls in the morning. Calls at night. It was all I needed. Now it was my turn to play. I had everything I needed. The evidence. The motive. The knowledge that my wife, the woman I had loved and trusted, had been sneaking around with another man. I had every reason to expose her immediately, to confront her and watch the guilt flood her face. But I wanted more than that. I wanted her to feel the walls close in. I wanted her to realize what she was losing before she actually lost it. So I played the long game. The first step was getting closer to her. If Melissa expected distance, I gave her the opposite. I became the doting husband, the man who suddenly had more time to take her to lunch, to bring her coffee at work, to randomly show up at home early just to surprise her. At first, she seemed pleased. Then, slowly, I saw the cracks forming. The hesitation when I kissed her, the slight anxiety in her smile when I asked about her day. She was afraid. Not because she suspected I knew, but because I was making it harder for her to keep her secret. And that was exactly what I wanted. The next step was Mike. I had never seen the man in person, but I knew where he worked, and I knew his schedule well enough by now. One afternoon, I parked across the street from his plumbing office and waited. It didn't take long. Mike stepped out of the building, laughing with a coworker, completely unaware that the husband of the woman he was sleeping with was watching him from across the street. He was younger than me. Not by much, maybe 5 years, but enough to make me wonder if that was what had drawn Melissa to him. Did she see him as an escape? A man with no responsibilities, no history, no baggage. Did she think he was exciting? It didn't matter. Because by the time I was done, Mike wouldn't seem so exciting anymore. That night, I put phase 2 into action. Melissa had told me she was going out with the girls. Another lie. I knew exactly where she was going. Instead of waiting at home like the clueless husband she thought I was, I drove to the same restaurant she and Mike had chosen for their little rendezvous. I parked a few spaces away, just out of sight, and watched as she stepped out of her car, her phone in her hand, her eyes scanning the lot. Then Mike pulled up. She smiled, that smile. The one that used to be just for me. The one I hadn't seen in months. And that was the moment. That was the moment I realized there was nothing left to save. Melissa wasn't some lost soul looking for herself. She wasn't trying to fix our marriage. She had already moved on. She just hadn't told me yet. I could have walked up to them right then. I could have made a scene, confronted them, embarrassed them both in public. But that wasn't good enough. I wanted her to lose everything. Instead of confronting her, I left. I spent the rest of the night at a bar, nursing a drink while I finalized my plan. By the time I got home, Melissa was already in bed. She hadn't even bothered to wait up for me. Good. Because soon, she wouldn't be sleeping here at all. The final step, a little home improvement. The next morning, while Melissa was in the shower, I picked up my phone and dialed the plumbing company. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice friendly. "I had some work done at my house a few weeks ago by a guy named Mike. There's still an issue with the sink. Think you could send him back out?" Of course, the receptionist chirped. "Mike's free tomorrow afternoon. Does that work?" "Perfect," I said, smiling to myself. Melissa had invited another man into our home. Now, I was going to do the same. Tomorrow, my wife and her lover would be standing in the same house I had built for us. And she wouldn't even see it coming. The day of Mike's visit, I made sure everything was set. Melissa had no idea. She thought I was at work. But instead, I was parked down the street, waiting. At exactly 2:15 p.m., a white company truck pulled into our driveway. Mike stepped out, toolbox in hand, looking casual, like a man with nothing to hide. I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse steady. Showtime. I waited a full 5 minutes before making my move. Just enough time for Melissa to greet him, for them to relax, for her to think she was safe. Then, I drove up to the house, parked in my usual spot, and walked inside like I owned the place. Because I did. The moment I stepped through the door, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Mike's voice was low and amused. "I missed you." Melissa giggled. "You saw me 2 nights ago." I felt a strange detachment as I stepped around the corner. My heart should have been pounding, my emotions should have been running wild. But instead, I was calm. Because I had already won. Melissa's back was to me. Mike, on the other hand, was facing the entrance, and the second he saw me, his entire face changed. His smirk dropped. His body tensed. Melissa must have noticed because she turned around. Her smile faded. "Jake." I held up a hand, cutting her off. Then, I turned to Mike. "You must be the plumber." Silence. Melissa's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Mike hesitated. He looked at Melissa as if waiting for some kind of cue. Then, to my surprise, he actually straightened up and tried to play it cool. "Yeah. You called the office about the sink?" I let out a small laugh. He really thought he could talk his way out of this. "No, Mike," I said, my voice level. "I called the office because I wanted you here. I wanted to meet the guy who's been sleeping with my wife." Mike's expression flickered. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the panic behind his eyes. Melissa stepped forward. "Jake, please, let's." I ignored her. My attention was on Mike. "Tell me," I said, tilting my head. "What's it like? Screwing another man's wife in the house he pays for?" Mike's confidence cracked. "Look, man, I didn't." "You didn't what?" I asked. "Didn't mean to. Didn't think I'd find out." He had nothing. Melissa reached for my arm, her voice shaking. "Jake, stop. We can talk about this." I finally looked at her. And for the first time in weeks, I saw the panic. The realization. She wasn't in control anymore. "You want to talk?" I asked quietly. She nodded desperately. I smiled. "Great. Let's talk in court." Melissa had no idea what I had been up to. She didn't know that I had already met with a lawyer. That I had already secured proof of her affair. That, in the eyes of the law, she had just given me everything I needed to file for divorce, and win. I turned on my heel and walked toward the front door. "Jake," she called after me. "Wait. Please." I didn't wait. I opened the door, stepped outside, and turned back just long enough to deliver the final blow. "By the way, Mike," I said, smirking. "Since you like fixing things so much, you might want to help Melissa find a new place to live." Then, I walked out, leaving them both standing there in the wreckage of their own choices. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a hotel, turned off my phone, and sat in the quiet, letting everything sink in. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just done. By morning, I had a plan. I went to work as if nothing had happened. I had a meeting with my lawyer that afternoon to finalize the paperwork, and by the end of the day, everything was in motion. Melissa had no idea that while she was probably panicking, trying to figure out how to spin her betrayal into something forgivable, I was making sure there was no way back for her. That evening, I returned home. Her car was in the driveway, and through the window, I could see her pacing in the living room. The moment I stepped inside, she ran to me, her face streaked with tears. "Jake," she gasped. "Where were you? I've been calling you all night." I set my keys on the counter and walked past her, heading straight for the bedroom. She followed, talking fast, her voice thick with desperation. "It wasn't what you think," she said. "I was stupid. I made a mistake. But I love you. You and I." I turned to face her. "You and I are done." The words hit her like a slap. Her breath caught, and she stared at me as if she couldn't believe I had actually said them. "Jake, please. It didn't mean anything." "It meant enough for you to sneak around," I interrupted. "It meant enough for you to lie to my face. It meant enough for you to risk everything we had." She grabbed my arm. "We can fix this. I'll end things with him. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, don't throw this away." I pulled away from her grasp. "You already did." I could see the panic setting in, the realization that I wasn't going to cave, that there were no magic words that would make this all disappear. She had gotten so used to lying that she had convinced herself she could lie her way out of this too. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a suitcase. When I unzipped it and started packing my clothes, she let out a broken sob. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Leaving," I said. She shook her head. "No, Jake. We can talk about this. We can fix it." I kept packing. "You should start packing too. You have until the end of the week to get out." Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "You're kicking me out." I zipped up my suitcase and finally looked at her. "It's my house. My name's the only one on the mortgage. And before you try to argue, my lawyer already knows about the affair. If you try to fight this, you'll lose." She covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. But I felt nothing. Whatever love I once had for her was gone. I grabbed my suitcase and walked toward the door. Before I left, I turned back to her one last time. "You did this to yourself." Then I walked out, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Melissa didn't leave right away. She spent the first few days in a daze, walking around the house like a ghost, as if she could somehow reverse everything by sheer willpower. She tried to act like we could go back to normal. She made my coffee in the mornings, asked about my day, even cooked my favorite meals. But it was pathetic. A performance. She knew the end was coming, but she still wanted to pretend there was something left to save. I refused to acknowledge her attempts. I slept in the guest room. I went to work early and came home late, making sure she had as little time as possible to get inside my head. She had already lived rent-free in my heart for too long. I was done. On the third night, she finally broke. I was lying on the guest bed when I heard a soft knock on the door. Before I could say anything, she opened it and stepped inside. She looked terrible. Her hair was messy, her eyes swollen from crying. Her voice was small when she spoke. "Jake. I don't know where to go." I stared at the ceiling, not answering. I could feel her waiting, hoping I'd offer something: comfort, reassurance, maybe even forgiveness. But I had nothing left for her. "I don't care," I said flatly. She let out a choked sob, but I didn't look at her. After a long silence, she finally left, shutting the door softly behind her. By the end of the week, she was gone. I didn't ask where she went, and I didn't look back. The divorce process was swift. I had prepared everything in advance. With the proof of her affair, Melissa had no ground to stand on. She signed the papers without a fight. No alimony. No share of the house. She walked away with whatever savings she had in her own name and nothing else. She moved out of my life as easily as she had moved out of the house. Mike, of course, was nowhere to be found. Their little fantasy had crumbled the moment I exposed them. He had lost his job, and whatever thrill he had once felt sneaking around with my wife had disappeared when reality hit. Melissa tried to reach out a few times. A text here. A voicemail there. Always the same desperate message: "I miss you. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" I never answered. One day, months later, I saw her by chance at a coffee shop. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her own choices had finally caught up with her. She spotted me, and for a moment, her eyes lit up with hope. I just walked past her. That was the last time I ever saw Melissa. The house no longer felt haunted. At first, the silence had been heavy, but over time, it became peaceful. I changed the furniture, painted the walls, made the space mine again. It felt like shedding old skin, like stepping into a new life. I started going out more. Seeing friends I had neglected during the slow decay of my marriage. I picked up old hobbies. I traveled. And eventually, when I was ready, I let myself love again. Melissa had thought she could have it all. That she could betray me and still keep me. That I would be too broken to leave. But in the end, she lost everything. And I won.